Okay, I think we should now can start the session. So hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for this special webinar. My name is Eric and I'm the Research Director at the AASB. As accountants, we have a responsibility to ensure financial reporting is meaningful, relevant, and applicable to society's needs. And research is essential because it helps us figure out what works well and what can be improved in various aspects, and considering we are living in this rapidly changing world. So evidence and findings from research play a big part in providing us with insights, and they may help us do things better. Today, we're here to talk about this important topic, insights and application of normative and empirical research in standard setting and accounting practice. To this end, we are fortunate to have three distinguished presenters who will share their insights and experience on this very subject. We will first have the presenters, whom I think many of you already know them very well, and then we'll have time for responding to audience questions or comments. So I encourage you to put in your questions or comments in the Q&A function at any point in time during the webinar. So perhaps let me first introduce visiting Associate Professor Brian Howison from the University of Adelaide. I've known Brian for many years. He has a long involvement with accounting standard setting, assisting in the AASB research projects, and is also an inaugural member of the AASB's academic advisory panel. He publishes widely in international journals. If you attended the AASB Research Forum in 2020, you would remember him presenting a topic on Are Accounting Standards Understandable? And this topic had been very popular and had also been cited in international standard setting meetings. Brian is a past president of AFANS, past vice president of the IAAER, and a past president of the South Australian division of CPA Australia. He was co-editor-in-chief of the Australian Accounting Review and served as associate editor or on the editorial board of several journals. And recently, Brian also received the Outstanding Contribution to Accounting and Finance Practice Award. The next person I'd like to introduce is Professor Kathleen Herborn from the University of Queensland. Kathleen has been actively involved in education, research, and standard setting work. She is a member of the AASB Academic Advisory Panel that provides comments on various standard setting and research projects. She has published widely in international journals on topics including corporate social responsibility, such as climate change and tax transparency, the role of financial accounting in informing capital markets in areas of ambiguity, such as impairments, biological assets, and also the accounting profession. She is also co-author on 5 editions of the Issues in Financial Accounting textbook. Last year, Kathleen also presented a research paper about reporting and assurance of material climate change-related risks disclosures at the AASB Research Forum, and the paper is now one of the AASB SSRN working paper. And finally, I'd like to introduce AASB Chair, Dr. Keith Kendall. Keith has lots of many years of working experience in many different areas, including served as a member of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, a partner at Rigby Kuku Lawyer, and extensive years of experience as an educator and researcher. Now, one of his visions as the chair of the AASB is to strengthen evidence-informed standard setting process. So welcome all presenters. So first up, I would like to introduce Brian because we'd like to hear from you, Brian, on your presentation. So I'm going to hand over the presentation to Brian. And I think Brian is putting his slides up, so we're just going to wait for a few seconds for him to do so.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Eric, for that very kind introduction. I trust everyone can see the slides and hopefully not see too much of me. A little bit about what I'm going to try and cover for the few minutes I'm yabbering away. you're obviously well aware of the topic, the normative and positive research, informing accounting, standard setting and practice. So I want to talk a little bit about how I'm going to frame that topic, or the direction I'm going to take on that topic. Partly I'll be talking about the importance of normative research and a need to return to that, but I think underlying this idea is also a need for academics, at least, to be engaged much more in conceptual type research as well. So that'll be essentially the way I'm trying to frame my discussion. I'll talk briefly about the relationship between normative and positive research and their importance to standard setting and practice. I hope to be slightly provocative by suggesting that at least over the 40 years I've been involved, there's been something of an academic retreat from engaging in normative research and matters conceptual. And I'll talk briefly about why I think that's the case. And no doubt that will get me into trouble. I want to finish by talking a little bit about the ways, again, primarily academics, but also practitioners, for instance, can contribute and engage productively with each other. And again, given the theme I've already identified, especially in the area of conceptual thinking. So that's largely where I want to go today. So I guess it's appropriate to start with some brief comments about the distinction between normative and positive research in accounting and auditing, for that matter. I think sure most of the audience will be familiar with the idea that normative issues are issues or questions about values, and we typically express that as questions about what should be the case. And we contrast that with positive research, which is concerned with issues of fact. What is happening, or how have share prices reacted, for example, to accounting information? Philosophers will tell us there's a bit more to it than that, of course, that no research is purely value-free, but that's really beyond what I want to talk about today. So we're essentially contrasting issues of values and choice with questions of fact. And as I signaled in a moment ago, I think that although that's the way the topic for today has been framed, underlying that really is a need for not just normative considerations, but also broadening the range of research that academics engage into in terms of thinking about conceptual problems, not just empirical problems. And I'll say more about that. And perhaps later during the session or during question time, I think there's also a role for practitioners here to re-engage in conceptual issues. So my take on this is that we see a vast body of empirical research being conducted. Academics are now engaging much more with standard setters, for instance, on with their research of an empirical nature. But as I'll talk about later, I don't feel there's much happening on the conceptual front. So we have an imbalance, and I'd like to get people thinking a little bit about how we might mitigate that imbalance. I think it's also really important to understand that when we're talking about the way in which research might contribute, it's really important for us all, particularly academics, to understand what it is that standard setters and practitioners actually do and what their needs are. And I'm not sure that, again, that as a discipline, academics are necessarily well informed about those sorts of things. So Eric mentioned in his introduction, for example, that the AASB and other standard setters are engaged, of course, in policy setting. They set standards, set rules for financial reporting and so on. And over the years that I've been involved, they've always looked for evidence. But I think nowadays this is much more formalized. There's much more engagement than there has been in the past. So standard setters are trying to make value judgments or choices about what the rules should be, and they look to academics to inform them with evidence about those choices. Practitioners, of course, on a day-to-day basis are always making choices in the context of particular clients or perhaps at an industry level but certainly at the level of individual clients, about what a particular accounting treatment should be for a type of transaction, or what should the disclosures be, what form should they take, and so on. So practitioners too are also very concerned about making value judgments, about making normative judgments. What's the best accounting practice in this particular case? So standard setters and practitioners are very much interested in normative questions. And I want to make a few observations about that. Given their roles, as far as standard setters and practitioners are concerned, if not all of us, ultimately the important questions are normative ones. What should be the rules in the standard? What should be the appropriate accounting disclosures? Which choice of accounting method should we make in this case? And so ultimately, that's what standard setters and practitioners are interested in. They're looking for guidance to help them make these decisions about what they should do in particular cases. Now, philosophers will tell you that facts do not resolve or do not answer normative value questions. The fact that we might be able to demonstrate that security prices increase when accounting method X is used doesn't necessarily mean that we therefore should use method X. These are separate questions philosophically, if you'll pardon my indulgence. But having facts does allow for informed decisions. It's much better that we have some sense about what potential consequences might be of our choices than simply operate blindly. I used to say to my students before I retired, much better we have some idea about what might happen when you drop the atomic bomb than you just drop it and see what happens. We like to be informed about what potential consequences might be. So it's really important to appreciate that although we often talk about normative and positive as though they are separate things, they are closely interrelated. And normative choices that standard setters and practitioners make, and here I'll make a value judgment, should be informed by evidence. Now, there are at least three ways in which positive research contributes to standard setting, at least. The first of those is telling us something about what is currently happening. Do we have a problem, and do we need to use up scarce resources on that problem? So if I understand things correctly, the AASB recently had an example of this. They placed on their work program a project dealing with revising the disclosures associated with dividend franking. This project came onto the work program as the result of some constituents raising some concerns with the AASB. However, before taking that project too much further, the AASB became aware of some research that in fact questioned how widespread these concerns really were. And so the AASB was able to redirect its resources to other projects. It discovered that this particular issue was not as actually demanding or widespread as had originally been anticipated. So that's one way in which research helps us. As I implied a bit earlier, another very important role for research is to help us predict what might happen if we choose a particular accounting policy. If policy X is chosen over policy Y, what difference will it make? Who will be affected and in what way? Will information quality be improved? And there are many examples of research doing just that. But one field of research that would be a good example is what we call behavioral accounting, which is research that looks at the way in which people use information for their financial decisions. So we can provide, through that research, examples of different types of disclosures to investors, for example, or security analysts, and learn from their feedback which type of disclosures lead to the best quality information. And the third way in which research helps policy setting, of course, is by providing feedback. It tells us something about what did happen when the chosen policy was actually implemented. Did the standard achieve what we anticipated it would? Were there some unexpected consequences? And we might evaluate whether those unexpected consequences were desirable or undesirable. These days, we see a very formal process in standard setting where the PIRs, post-implementation reviews, in which academics are being encouraged more and more and engaged more and more in providing feedback from their research about the implications or consequences of standards. Now, I've mentioned already that I think that over the time I've been involved, we see a lot more engagement now from academics with standard setters across those three types of dimensions I've just mentioned. But most of that research I would describe as empirical and in a simplistic way, descriptive. I don't mean that in an offensive way. It's trying to describe what actually happened or what might happen. And I think that over the time, there has been a retreat amongst academics from engaging in normative research. And in particular, as I've highlighted, I think engaging in conceptual research. Now, there are a few reasons for that, but some of them come from academics themselves. I'm old enough, not quite to have been around when this paper was written, but certainly shortly afterwards, to be aware of this paper by Joel Dembski in the Accounting Review back in 1973, who provided a very elegant argument as to why achieving normative accounting standards was not possible. And his argument essentially was that it's not possible to design a set of rules which will universally meet the preferences of different individuals, because everyone has different preferences and beliefs. Back a bit later on in 1985, perhaps the nail in the coffin was a less elegant assertion by Watson Zimmerman in their positive accounting theory book that the best type of research was positive research, with the implication that normative research was not the best, shall I put it. And I think, among other things, these two documents really allowed academics to, perhaps a bit too strongly for this, but to wash their hands of engagement with normative issues. It allowed academics, I think, to say, well, this is really not our department. We're engaged in finding facts. And so we're not really going to engage much more in normative research. And I think, there's been some change over time that people realize that the research has to be seen to be making a difference. And you will see a lot of comments at the end of papers, academic papers, in which people say our results should be of interest to standard setters and practitioners, but they never actually say how. So I think there's been a retreat from engaging in normative and conceptual types of issues. Now, the two things that are important to acknowledge. The first is that Dembski's argument was a very strong one and is a very strong one. But the issue of managing preferences in a pluralist society like our own is managed by political processes, albeit imperfect ones. But we, for example, when we write standards, we go through a process of what we call due process, in which different parties can express their preferences and beliefs about what the rules should be. So those differences in opinion are managed via the due process. It's also very important to recognise, of course, that the body or the group that has authority and responsibility for making normative accounting and auditing decisions are the standard setters. Academics are not charged with that responsibility by the community. The community has laid that with standard setters. But it doesn't then follow that Dembski's argument and the institutional arrangements for standard setting mean that academics should not be making normative contributions. A couple of reasons for this, of course. Firstly, as you can see on the screen, academics are still widely viewed as relatively independent participants in the standard setting process. Many other constituents, understandably, they come with their particular outcome or particular agenda in mind. And they will argue to that. And that's not unreasonable, but obviously brings with it certain biases. Academics also, for the reasons I talked about earlier, can provide recommendations based on the evidence they've collected. So academics have a key role to play in informing the normative choices that standard setters and practitioners have to make. So what are the ways in which they can contribute? Well, I'm sure Keith will talk more about the first couple of dot points here, so I won't say too much about these. There isn't much in the way of submissions to exposure drafts for these days, but should be from academics. Participation in roundtables, writing research reports and working papers, for example, and I'm sure Keith will talk about that. My pet bugbear, I guess, is that I really feel that we need to engage much more with standard setters and practitioners so that we can develop informed models of how the world works. At the recent AFANS conference, I attended a lot of papers where we found lots of statistical associations between things, but intuitively, when you ask the authors why would we expect to see what they found, they were generally a bit flustered because not enough thought has gone into informing themselves about how the world might actually work. So we need to engage with practitioners and standard setters to understand their world so that we can derive meaningful implications for their choices and their practices. And this is my link into the point I raised earlier. I think a key thing that we're not doing these days very well is researching conceptual problems, thinking conceptually to inform both our own research and the choices that practitioners and standard setters make. Let me just give you a couple of very simple examples. These don't have to be changing the world type thinking. Definitions are a key component of our reporting framework, but we don't see a lot of work going into the creation or construction of definitions. Many years ago, back in the 90s, I prepared this monograph for what was then the Australian Accounting Research Foundation, exploring how might we account for investment properties. There was no standard at that time. And a chapter is devoted to, in that monograph, to defining what an investment property might be. And when I was a young lad, like many other academics, I would look at standards and I'd see reliable and substantial or whatever it might be and think, why do they use these weasel words? Why can't they just say what they mean? Well, I discovered through this experience that it's actually very difficult to identify characteristics that would suitably distinguish investment properties from other types of real property. They have many different characteristics. Should it be on the basis of whether or not the primary operations of the entity are investment, for example? Or should it be linked more to the type of potential or future economic benefits that are generated by the asset? What do we do when we have real property that is being used partly for manufacture and partly for renting to other parties, and so on and so forth? So all these things, they can be informed by doing surveys, for example, can be informed by evidence, but we actually need to think logically about what the properties are that will help us create the definition. A similar definitional issue I engaged in much later, associated with control, the concept of control in AASB 10 for consolidation purposes, in defining the reporting entity. Here, I did a survey of participants in both the not-for-profit private and not-for-profit public sector about how did they understand the concept of control. Now, you might say, well, that's an empirical piece, that's a survey, but it's still engaged in trying to conceptually identify conceptual differences between how constituents who are supposed to be applying the standard and standard setters who have written the standard and have certain objectives in mind, where are they different? And how can the standard be supplemented? And how can the participants or constituents be educated to reconcile their different conceptual perspective of control with that of the standard? And I'll end with some rather reluctant language on my part with some big picture issues. I mentioned earlier Watson-Zimmermann, for example. One of the things they perhaps inadvertently ended up doing was making big picture issues unfashionable amongst academics. So the early normative researchers such as Chambers and Sterling and others tried to construct grand theories about accounting. And that, of course, has its problems. But I think we are now at a point in time of reporting where, again, we need people to engage in big picture thinking. So one obvious context is in the context of non-capital market settings. So a lot of research is done within capital markets, but a lot of the constituents and a lot of the work that AASB and practitioners do is in the not-for-profit sector and in the public sector. And there's still a great deal of work to be done in thinking about information usefulness in that context. Everyone has rushed to do research in sustainability reporting, a bit like the gold rushes of the 19th century. But again, we haven't really thought very carefully about what user needs and what role information might play in this setting. This is a major change in our discipline, both for practice and for standard setting and academia. And people are rushing into this without giving much thought to frameworks or approaches. Even the recent IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standard, S1, essentially takes the language of the financial reporting conceptual framework and just plonks it in the context of sustainability. Now, I appreciate that, of course, the ISSB is interested in the financial consequences of sustainability. But again, here is an opportunity for us to think about, are we really taking concepts that are that fit well in this sustainability concept or context, sorry. And I guess I'm a bit concerned that we're rushing too quickly without thinking about the suitability of transplanting one type of framework into another, especially when the IASB's conceptual framework is largely derived from current practices than broad conceptual thinking. So as usual, I've rabbited on too much, but thanks very much for your attention.
No, Brian, thank you so much for your insight. And I think especially those concrete examples are really helpful. And I can't agree more about researching concepts because there's so many opportunities in this space, right? For example, the AASB is monitoring on the digital assets or crypto asset space. You know, there are so many different forms and characteristics. Yep. And then we're also working on projects on intangible assets. Again, the objective of that is to reviewing the definition of intangible assets, whether it's still relevant to the world today. So again, there's so many opportunities on researching concepts. So next up, I would like to now introduce Kathleen to share her views, and also anyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function. And I think Kathleen is putting up her slides. Excellent. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Brian. I think our presentations, our talks may intertwine a little bit. Thank you for the invitation. It's exciting to talk about. So looking at the types of issues that I intend to discuss today, there's a quick outline here. As a bit of background, as Eric mentioned earlier, I was very fortunate to be involved with the 2022 Australian Accounting Standards Board Research Forum with two early career academics. It was an amazing experience for us, extremely positive. At the forum, the AASB allowed us to have access to their stakeholders, so we had some unique insights into practitioners' perspectives, and we have 3 papers that have come from that at various stages. I hope the practitioners who were involved in the project also benefited from the opportunity to air their views, to ask questions of us, and for us to be able to publicise that. I also hope that the AASB got something valuable out of that. Okay, so why do we have a need for high quality accounting standards? In short, it's because of information asymmetry. So managers have different information to external stakeholders like investors and creditors. So for example, the hidden information problem. managers have an information advantage about the future prospects of firms, and investors don't know if they're investing in a lemon or a Lamborghini. Another example is the hidden action problem or moral hazard. So managers have direct insight into their own actions in a contract, but stakeholders like investors cannot observe this behaviour. So the idea is that high quality accounting standards will allow the timely and the credible conversion of this inside information to publicly available information so that creditors and investors, for example, can have insights into a company's future prospects as well as to managers' actions. So then the key question for standard setters such as the AASB is, how can they determine that accounting standards are of high quality? And this is where the normative researchers have been helpful. So if you look through three really, really broad periods, we sort of start with the inductive. And these researchers looked at what was being done in practice and tried to justify and explain what was happening. We then went to a deductive period where, for example, the researchers were proposing what they perceived to be the one true model that would provide information that was useful to everyone. So they're often called the true income models. And standard setters have now landed on decision usefulness. That is, different decisions require different types of information. So the FASB in the States has done this, as has the AASB. And I noticed that Brian referred to the conceptual framework. I've taken paragraph 1.2 from the framework, and it specifically says the objective of financial reporting is to provide financial information that is useful in making decisions. So what normative researchers have done is they've provided guidance on what constitutes high quality accounting standards. This creates an opportunity for empirical researchers to contribute to standard setters. So in particular, empirical researchers can assist the AASB in producing evidence-based policies that result in decision useful information. So it sounds quite simple, doesn't it? Use sound theory and empirical evidence and produce better policies that are based on scientific and empirical evidence. So it raises two questions. What types of insights have empirical researchers provided standard setters to date? And what are some of the challenges that empirical researchers face? So I've put together something that is by no means comprehensive. It was just to give some insight. I've drawn from various academic literature reviews. So there's general consensus around policy relevant economic links and conceptual insights. And I've listed 3 examples. So we tend to agree that if you increase corporate disclosure, you increase market liquidity. The second consensus is if you're going to have a disclosure, there's a trade-off between its relevance and its reliability. And thirdly, managerial incentives mean that if a standard is produced, and there will always be ambiguity and discretion allowed, which is a good thing, but managers will use this discretion so that when you look at one standard, it can be implemented in various different ways by different companies. Okay, so we've got these general insights, but that still leaves standard setters in a bit of a bind because they have to interpret and then apply it in specific contexts. So we also have a substantial body of research on the economic consequences of specific changes in, say, accounting standards and market regulation. And Brian raised a few examples there. But this is not without challenges. So what I've done is really put together a list of all the challenges that empirical researchers face in being able to help standard setters. Number 1, causal inferences. So being able to say if standard X is implemented, it has outcome A in the capital markets. It's very difficult because we operate in the real world. And so we're looking at quasi-experiments. We can't keep everything stable. So we have this issue of internal validity. So if we're saying this standard causes this outcome, because it's only a quasi-experiment, we have to make sure we control for the antecedents. So company characteristics, is this happening because the companies are more profitable, they're larger, or they're in particular industries? And then when we look at the outcome, we need to control for concurrent confounds. So for example, is this happening because of the political situation? Is this happening because of what's happening in the broader economy? And then if we say, okay, we'll look at voluntary disclosures that companies make, we face the issue of self-selection bias. So then again, that's another limitation of what we can provide to standard setters. The second challenge with these causal inferences is construct validity. So we really struggle to cleanly measure the outcome of an accounting change. We have underdeveloped proxies. Take, for example, the amount and quality of financial information. That's unobservable, so we have to use quite noisy proxies. So therefore, we can't say to the AASB, well, this capital market outcome will occur if the accounting standard increases the quality of information by X%. The second issue that we face with empirical research is a lack of data. We face the lack of relevant data as well as the aggregation. So we lack the granularity. When I say relevant, oftentimes the data is proprietary or it's not observable. And so we have to use crude proxies. So if we were looking at audit quality, we would use things like discretionary accruals or financial restatements. Similarly, when we look at the granularity of data, oftentimes we're trying to infer consequences of standards based on aggregated consolidated financial statements. So the aggregation is quite high, and those figures are impacted not only by the standard, but by the economics of the company itself. The third problem we have is the aggregation and transmission of results. So these results often reside in dense academic journals that are of differing quality. So for a time-poor standard setter, there's not the incentive to sit down and trawl through these studies. And lastly, and quite concerningly, there's questions about the reliability of some of these results. So this is creating perverse incentives amongst researchers in this publish or perish situation. And so you find things like p-hacking. That is, you select the model that gives you the best p-value, the best statistical result, and then you invent the front end to suit that. So you've got a false positive that the standard setter has to deal with. Another example is harking, so hypothesizing after knowing your results. You write the front end once you've got the results. Again, that's a false positive and it's not particularly helpful to a standard setter. Lastly, we've got the surgence of paper mills, so companies that you can pay to write your results. So there's data fabrication, there's result fabrication, and that's quite concerning. So does this mean that empirical researchers have nothing to offer? I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I would suggest with the causal inferences, this is common in social sciences. And so what we need to do is recognize this as a limitation when we design our research projects. And we also need to continue to work on econometric methods to try and overcome some of these limitations. In terms of a lack of data, as Brian said, have a look at the work program of the standard setter and see what is a topic that's coming up. Research something of relevance to practitioners and standard setters. The AASB Research Forum is an excellent opportunity to actually provide research that speaks to the standard setter's priority. I would also suggest that we break out of our very, very narrow corporate finance, empirical financial accounting silos and engage with sociologists, psychologists, and economists to try and provide some insights into what are really quite complex issues. And as part of that, use not only archival empirical research, but why not have interviews and surveys to try and bring together evidence from many, many different perspectives. Aggregation and transmission of results. Now, I've seen some new journals coming out that are trying to bridge this gap. So the landscape within universities for researchers is changing. We no longer just look at publishing in this super A-star journal, which probably 13 academics will actually read, and we've got pressure to show that we're researching with impact. So that's the onus on us to support these journals as they're coming up, and also to create a portfolio of research that's not just targeting academic journals, but also targeting journals that are a bridge over to the practitioners and standard setters. Reliability of results, that's also our responsibility as researchers. And you see some of the top journals now requiring data sets as well as the code to be submitted when a paper is about to be published. Journal editors are very aware of this, and they're starting to go back through past editions to try and identify any research misconduct. And if you're ever bored, Retraction Watch is a very interesting platform where you get a photograph of who's been bad with their research and the retractions that are available. So I wanted to finish on that positive note that, yes, we do have some responsibilities as researchers, and you can tell it's a bit of a soapbox of mine, but hopefully I've given some ideas about what I think is possible for researchers to be able to assist standard setters and ultimately practitioners. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen, and for the examples of the challenges and some solutions on bridging the gaps between academic research and the practice implications for the standard setters and also the professionals. Keith, I'm now going to ask you to provide your insights and your thoughts about this topic.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks very much to both Brian and Kath for their particularly good insights. And I do hope that the audience takes a lot of what was said to heart. And at the AASB, we can start seeing some more influential and, dare I say, impactful normative research. So, look, I've been asked to provide the standard setters perspective, and it's one of the things that that I've been wanting to see some more in terms of informing our standard setting process is more of a normative approach. So as we've been discussing today, positive research definitely has its place, and as our two presenters were pointing out, I think it's a false positive it's a false dichotomy that for anyone to think that this is an either-or situation, that you've either got to be all normative or positive research only is the way to go. It's really a mix, and standard setting really is where the intersection of normative and positive research comes together. So I don't want anyone to go away thinking that I'm saying that positive research is not relevant to accounting standard setting. Certainly not the case. But what I'm definitely pushing is that normative research definitely has a place in our thinking. And so I think this was implicit in the two presentations that we've just heard from, but I'd make the point explicitly. The way I view both of these forms of research is the positivist research. Positive research is telling us what is actually going on, what is happening. Normative research tells us what should be the case. And so consequently, this presents a very good framework in which to demonstrate the value of both of these forms of research. As a standard setter, and as has been noted quite a few times, we pursue an evidence-informed approach to standard setting at the AASB. The positive research, the empirical research can tell us if there's a problem, can tell us if a standard is working. I mean, this is most notably demonstrated in the post-implementation reviews that we conduct. And we can find out, we can ask the empirical questions, is the standard working in that particular context? Is it working the way it was intended to work? Or is there some sort of problem going on? It can help us identify where the problems are. The difficulty or the shortcoming of positive research is that if there is a problem, it doesn't tell us what the solution should be. That's where normative research comes in. And so providing that theoretical framework, whether it's part of a big picture view of accounting, as Brian was talking about, or it's something a little bit more narrow, addressing a conceptual issue, it definitely has its place. Now, one of the things that I also wanted to draw upon from Brian's presentation as well is this notion of evidence-informed standard setting. And I think it's probably a good way to think about evidence, maybe a bit more of an expanded definition. When we usually talk about evidence, we tend to think in most cases, at least this has been my experience, we tend to think in most cases about empirical evidence. But there's no reason why theoretical or conceptual evidence can't also be included in this definition as well. So if we start thinking about it that way, then perhaps where things are being slotted into can help as well. Now, Brian also made another point as well that I wanted to highlight particularly, in that the AASB does conduct a lot of stakeholder outreach, conducts our own research in terms of gathering information to inform the standard setting process properly. Academics have a crucial role to play because in the main, academics are seen to be independent, is the word Brian used, and what I'll add to that is the evidence that they provide, given that independence, is considered objective. The academics don't have an agenda to push. They're not pursuing a pre-intended outcome as part of that agenda. That at least is the expectation. Now, one of the things that I'd implore all academics, not only listening to this, but academics that are working at the moment, you need to guard that position zealously. Maintain that independence, keep that objectivity. I have seen some situations where, unfortunately, that agenda pushing starts to creep in. Not so much financial accounting itself. I haven't seen that so much. There's a little bit of it in sustainability reporting, but also other disciplines that I've seen over my career as well. It's a very easy position to fall into in terms of adopting a particular point of view, and then I'll use this term advisedly. I mean, Brian started being controversial, so why can't I? Exploiting the independence that academics have built, the academic community has built up over decades, and therefore presenting what is really slanted evidence, evidence that's designed to produce a particular outcome or to pursue a particular perspective, as objective, which it isn't. There's a place for advocacy, but if academic evidence is being presented as objective, it needs to be objective. And that's really where academic research derives its value from. We have lots of advocates pushing particular angles. We turn to the academic community for the objective, independent viewpoint. So I do implore you, guard that position very, very jealously. Don't give that up. Now, with one thing that one other aspect that I wanted to point out as well, empirical evidence is often presented as being objective, and oh well, this is how the case is, and so must be. But those of you that have thought about this to any great extent would probably know that that's not actually the case. So what the outcome that empirical evidence produces is often influenced by the paradigm that's been adopted, so the particular research framework. And to that end, I'd like to point audience members to an article that appeared in the Australian Accounting Review. I believe it was in 2020, but it may have been in 2021 by Kevin Stevenson and Matthew Pinnock, where they go through in quite in good enough detail, demonstrating how the particular research paradigm that's chosen for a particular project can influence the outcome. So that demonstrates that positive research is not objective in the way that a lot of people might think it is. It's objective in the sense that it's not pushing a particular perspective. However, it's not a completely neutral view of the world, is probably the best way I can think of expressing it. Now, look, I won't go into this much further. You've heard from both Brian and Kathleen, who are much better presenters on this area than I am. So you've heard the expert point of view. What I'll finish on before we turn it over to the Q&A is to refer back again to Brian's presentation, where he skipped over a bit, saying that I would go and cover the specific opportunities where academics can contribute to the AASB's research processes. I've already mentioned the post-implementation reviews that we conduct. So this is we aim to do a post-implementation review about 3 years after implementation of a standard, and so we're doing a number of those at the moment. That's one way that's very much a research-driven process. So academics can contribute to that. Brian very briefly mentioned submissions to exposure drafts and participation in round tables. I would certainly encourage academics to do that. And particularly, it's always very good to get a fresh, specifically written piece for a particular inquiry that we're undertaking. But if a short submission and then bringing to our attention the more detailed published relevant work that has been produced on the issue, that's also very valuable. So I'd ask academics, bring to our attention the idea, the research that you think is relevant to what we're doing. We also produce a number of research reports, and one of the things Eric made allusion to at the start of today's webinar, Eric made allusion to the fact that over the last few years, we've really been trying to strengthen at the AASB our reliance on conceptual foundations, academic research for our work program. And so in terms of the research reports, in terms of our overall work program, the new technical projects that we take on board, we're undertaking a real push to have solid conceptual foundations. Now that for the work, and so setting the direction that we take with this. So this is a real place for normative research in particular. Tell us what the conceptual thinking is around this matter. what the different options are, the strengths and disadvantages of all the different options. This is very valuable information to us. Kath also mentioned the AASB Research Forum, which I'd always encourage you to do that, and to look at submitting, and in particular normative projects. We're always keen to see relevant normative projects being proposed through that channel. There's the SSRN working paper series, and again, encouraging normative papers to be submitted to that. All of those are read at the AASB. Where we can, we incorporate that into our work program. Where we can't incorporate that into our current work program, it's put to one side, ready to pull off the shelf when it does become relevant to our work program. So it has impact in that way, in that it puts ideas on our agenda, and we seek to go and expand our work agenda when the time is right on that front. And the final thing that I'll mention is that we're in the process of developing some new channels to promote research that through the AASB that's relevant to the standard setting work that we do. And one of those channels is intended to be dedicated to normative research. So for those of you that might be interested in pursuing normative research, through the AASB, we'll have a channel that that be able to promote that research and at least bring it to our attention, and so we can incorporate it into our thinking. Look, on that note, I'll hand back to Eric and open it up for the Q&A. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Keith. So we received some questions and comments. I'll start with a comment by David. So David's saying that he agrees with the comments on sustainability reporting, in particular on usefulness of some of the metrics such as the Scope 3 emissions. And I think Brian would agree with David's comments that certainly there are a lot of conceptual thinking needs to be developed in that space, and particularly understanding what user needs are with all the information being disclosed. And then Tom Scott have a question. What do you think about positive papers with an expanded policy implications section? And that is, the paper is positive, but there's one section is normative, which is a hybrid method of presenting an academic paper. So I'll start that question with Brian.
All right, thanks, Eric, and thanks, Tom. Well, I have a few quick observations, or I hope they're quick. One is I thought that's probably what we should already be doing. So I think certainly I would agree with you that there needs to be much more thought and attention given into the average paper about what are the policy implications of what the authors have found in their study. The other aspect of it, perhaps, that I think concerns, well, let me just say that I think one of the reasons we don't see that at the moment is there's probably too much research going on in people's offices rather than out engaging with practitioners. So I think one reason why people struggle to be able to write what the implications might be is they don't really have any background or grounding to do that. And that goes back to the point I made earlier. I think that more thought also needs to go into the model that the authors are building before they conduct their study. So how are they modeling the world? So I think those things need to all come together. And again, that really requires people to go out and engage with practitioners rather than try to think about implications in a vacuum.
Thanks, Brian. Can I check whether, Kathleen, would you like to comment on that too? Thanks.
That would be an amazing thing to have happen. I think that would encourage a deep think and stop people just running these models and getting statistically significant results. And instead of being very vague about the policy implications, this would be so helpful to standard setters because you've basically got an explicit statement. You might not agree with it, but I think that would be a really good thing to have happen.
Thanks, Kathleen. Okay, we'll move on to the next question from Michael Bradbury. So far, no one has mentioned case studies. Empirical studies often provided statistical averages, for example, the average of non-audit fees to total audit fees. However, standard setters are often interested in outliers, that is the high end of non-audit fees to total audit fees or the lower end of it. Case studies can examine outliers. Any comments? Who would like to answer this question first? Brian.
I agree, Mike, as you probably would know. So I did have in some other notes for myself, depending on how the post-presentation discussion went, to note that there is now much more interest and acceptance in academia about the case studies and other sort of small sample qualitative research. And I think these are invaluable in providing much greater insight into what's happening, although it's much more concentrated or not as wide in its breadth. It's much more focused on depth, and I think that's really important. We learn a lot more from that. And I also think that case studies and so on and small scale projects actually provide an opportunity to work more closely with practitioners. So because practitioners are much more focused in on individual clients and so forth, there's opportunities, I think, for practitioners and academics to work together on cases, for instance.
Kathleen, would you like to comment on that too? Or?
Yes, having conducted some case study research myself, I think it's invaluable. And it gets back to the point I was making, that if you use multiple different methods to attack a problem, you will get further. So you can get the detail from the cases. And I hadn't thought about outliers. I mean, the issue, I guess, with case study research is getting an organization or an entity to agree. So while it might be really informative to have outliers, I think the reality is you go with organizations who are willing to work with you. But I think a combination of approaches is always preferred.
Thanks, Kathleen. Keith, would you like to comment on it too?
Well, yeah, following on from Kath's point there, the different methods always provide different insights. One of the points that I mentioned is the outcomes, the results will often be dependent on the paradigm that's chosen and also the methodology that's chosen. So case studies, I see case studies as being particularly valuable. Outliers are an obvious case where this could be the situation, but not only just outliers as well. I mean, I've been speaking to a couple of academics recently about potential case study research that they're talking about pursuing, which does sound very exciting. So quite interested in seeing that. And that the way I see case studies, whilst the results can't be generalizable, that's not the point. And it can lay the foundation for making us look into areas that might have been missed with more aggregated approaches. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Keith. Okay, so the next question is from Janice Loftus. Thanks to all speakers for your presentations and to AASB for hosting this excellent webinar. I have a question for Brian. Do you think that a shift towards more conceptual and normative research might pose challenges for journal editors and reviewers? I'll also ask a question to Kathleen later. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Janice. You always ask me the hardest questions. Well, short answer is yes, because just as other types of research require a particular skill set, I think conceptual work is obviously not for everyone either. I can see that Mike has asked a very similar question, but I might try and not get too far ahead of us because there's some other comments I'd make about that. But yes, I think that in short, Janice, editors and reviewers who have been around in a system that's gone long enough dominated by a particular set of empirical work may struggle to find a benchmark, a suitable benchmark in their mind by which to judge this sort of work. Clearly, the logic of the argument is in the one criterion, and we have established rules since at least Aristotle for those, or for that aspect. But yes, it will require some retraining, I think, and some acceptance on the part of editors that not everything has to be statistically proven, so to speak. I'd point out the paper by Dembski, for example, is of the type I'm mentioning, because it's actually an analysis, or a mathematical analysis, or logical analysis, I should say, of the arguments for why not everyone's preferences can be aligned. So it's a good example, but again, we're talking about 1973, not 2023.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Kathleen?
Yes, I think the next question also gets to that, as Brian suggested. It's going to be a problem, let's be honest, for journal editors and for reviewers. And this is where I guess we would be looking at cross-disciplinary journals, because working as I do in a very large business school, there are other disciplines that have no trouble at all with this normative conceptual reasoning, and they will publish papers. And so we really, rather than expecting us to acquire all of the skills, why don't we start working with people who do have those skills? And the second comment would be these journals that I've seen starting to come up that are policy orientated are a very, very good place to send this type of material.
Thanks, Kath. Keith, do you want to also comment on the same question?
Well, not being an editor, it's a bit hard for me to provide direct information to that, but I would certainly like to see editors take a more relaxed approach, without relaxing rigor, of course, but not be as focused on empirical research as what we've seen over the last 30 odd years, I would say. But aside from saying I'd like to see more of it, and that's why the AASB is trying to open up its own channels to try to provide outlets for that. And so I make a call out to any editors that might be somewhat sympathetic to this. I know Andrew Jackson at the Australian Journal of Management is making deliberate efforts to encourage papers that present their policy implications, which is an excellent start. But aside from that, I don't think I can add much to what Brian and Kathleen have said on the matter.
Thanks, Keith. Okay, the next question is very interesting. It's actually related to education piece from Michael Bradbury. One particular problem is that academics are not well trained in normative thinking because it is not even taught in our undergraduate programs. How many of our undergraduate programs teach concepts of capital and income? That is, our students do not know what income means conceptually. So perhaps I'm going to get Kathleen to start this conversation first.
Yeah, I think Brian's far more equipped to do this. In my undergrad, I was taught by someone who was a student in the States of Edwards and Bell, and who'd also had lots of interactions with Chambers. So I know full well the agony of learning these concepts at an undergraduate level when I really wanted the easy option, which was to just do it. It requires a skill set that I don't know many academics have to even teach to the undergrads. So I'm at a loss as to what to suggest, but I'm sure Brian will be able to jump right in and help out.
Thanks, Kath. Brian?
Yeah. Thanks for your faith, Kath. It's very spooky how Mike seems to be able to read my mind. Well, I certainly have an opinion on this, though I'm not sure I have a solution. There was a time when we did try, well, in some schools at least, did try and teach logic. And again, as Kath mentioned, some resistance to that because it was not seen as being about accounting. But I would agree with Mike that even the academics are now very much out of touch. And one reason I would put down to this, and my finance colleagues would find this strange, is the observation that I think our training has now become very divorced from the economics discipline. So it is true that when we do finance, we are delving in a particular subset of economic theory, but in general economic theory, there's virtually no exposure at all these days, both to the students and to the staff. And I remember that when I first began my career, nearly all my colleagues would have come to accounting through an economics degree. So I think over time, people have become less engaged, well, have had no opportunity to engage with economic theory in a broad sense. And as a result, they're not so well equipped to engage with students on these matters of capital or income. Even sort of postgraduate honours programs and master's programs, for example, don't tend to go back to the older literature just because it happens to be old. The early writers of our discipline were very much engaged with key issues that are still facing the AASB and other standard setters, such as measurement and so on. But we're not exposing that literature to ourselves or to our students. So we really need to make some sort of conscious effort to re-engage with economics as a discipline.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so the next question I would like to discuss is about how can researchers and practitioners work collaboratively? Given that we have practitioners attending this webinar, I think many practitioners are having the question, how can they actually engage with researchers and work with researchers so that they can also contribute some of the experience and views and knowledge in the research process? Perhaps I'll start with Keith. Keith, do you want to answer that question?
Oh, thanks, Eric. I mean, that's probably one area to AASB might be front and centre where academics and practitioners come together. We talked about, in response to one of the questions before, case studies. That's an excellent place where either a practitioner's own organisation or assisting in identifying perhaps a client who would be open to the idea of being the subject of a case study, identifying where those opportunities might be, that would be an excellent start. But then there's also the surveys that academics often run. One of the perpetual problems that academics face is the relatively low response rates to surveys. So, I mean, there's a little bit of responsibility on academics to make sure the surveys aren't too onerous, because it is an imposition to be able to do that. But when approached for survey responses for research projects, to be open to that and to be sympathetic to that. So they're two areas that immediately spring to my mind where practitioners can work with the academics to promote research that's relevant for standard setting. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Keith. Catherine, would you like to comment on the same question as well?
Oh, sure. So I'm approaching it from a slightly different perspective. So the AASB is one organisation, and as researchers and academics, we have to respect that it can only support a limited number of, for example, ARC linkages. So I would recommend that as a researcher, you don't do this cynically because you need to tick that box. You've developed a research profile in a particular area. You've identified some really significant questions that you would like to ask, and then you approach someone like the AASB to facilitate those linkages. And I would also say there are other organisations out there besides the AASB, and you really just have to be thinking laterally. So if I was to use UQ as an example, I'm involved with an ARC linkage that's actually an agribusiness, and they're looking at how to train up their graduates, because they're going to go out and they're going to be pitching business models and business proposals for venture funding, venture capital. And so I reluctantly joined that, and I've learnt such an amazing amount, and I've got several ideas. So as researchers, again, it's our responsibility to not be cynical about it and to be quite genuine when we approach busy standard setters. And when opportunities come our way, not to automatically say no, but to think about what we can learn from that.
Thanks, Kath. And this question related to that is that, many practitioners do not think research, I have to reframe it, academic research is relevant to their work. And I think because many practitioners struggling with reading academic papers and understanding academic papers, how can we change that? How can we help practitioners to see the relevance of research in their work? Perhaps I'll start that question with Brian.
Well, I hate to say it, but I think they're probably right. And without being too cynical about it, I think partly a reason for that is that, as Kathleen mentioned, like everyone else, practitioners are very busy, but their focus is upon what I might call the micro level. So they're looking at the level of individual clients, or perhaps at the industry level at best, but typically at the level of particular clients, whereas academics are writing papers which they're trying to generalize wider results. So part of the solution to that, of course, is the one Mike mentioned earlier in his question about case studies. So engaging in case studies, for example, provides opportunities where the interests or the focus of practitioners and academics might be the same. I think another aspect of this that goes back to the previous question too, is that there needs to be trust built between the academic and the practitioner. And that doesn't sort of happen overnight, I'm afraid. So again, as Kath has sort of intimated, we need to work at building a reputation amongst standard setters and amongst practitioners that we can be trusted, and that we're not going to waste their time, and that if they speak to us, we're going to treat that information with respect. So as academics, ways we can do that, the way we can build our reputation, are often very simple things like acting as an instructor on the professional education programs, serving on committees of professional associations, presenting at professional conferences, writing in the professional journals. All of these things to help us develop a reputation where people who are not academics can see us as serious and as committed to their interests as well. So I think there are a number of things there for us to think about.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so I think what we have heard is that we need to work collaboratively and collectively. If you want to enhance the accounting standards and the practice, perhaps researchers need to approach practitioners and standard setters actively to understand the problems. And perhaps practitioners should also engage with academics to understand what skill sets academics can offer from their research and what insights they can provide for businesses. To that, I'm going to finish the sessions. Before I finish, are there any comments or suggestions that the panel would like to give? No? And are there any more questions from the audience? Okay, so I can't see any more other questions. So with that, I'm going to finish the sessions by thanking everyone attending this webinar and your participations. And especially I want to thank the presenters, Keith, Kathleen, and also Brian, to provide your time and insights for us to think about how we can make research much more impactful, that is relevant to the practice and also to the standard setters and also regulators and so on. So I think as Keith has mentioned, there are a lot of opportunities for you, everyone on the call, to be involved with the AASB's work. There are a lot of opportunities for you to give feedback on many different projects, especially lots of conceptual thinking on lots of different types of transactions in accounting we need to consider. So please feel free to reach out to the AASB if you would like to be involved. With that, I'm going to thank everyone and finish the webinar. Thank you, everyone.